Russ Baker, who's been on the program a number of times in the past, and who runs whowhatwhy.org, an independent investigative journalism site, has been running a series at whowhatwhy.org about the Boston Marathon bombing and how maybe things aren't exactly as we've heard. So Russ Baker is on the line with us. Hey, Russ.
Hey, Nicole.
Oh boy, you do sound bad. Russ told me that you're suffering from allergies, and I don't know if you saw that. I saw a news report last night. It might have on, I don't know, some news program, that this year they're saying the allergy season is going to be probably the worst ever because of the horrific winter we had and all the snow. So I guess you're feeling it, aren't you?
Yeah, so maybe allergies will actually get people to care about climate change.
Sure. Yeah, look, I think I don't know. I think they'll only care about it when their house is knocked down, and then they'll say, well, it didn't have anything to do with climate change. So who knows? It's the dumbing down of America. We are just officially like a nation of stupid people. That's all I can say. But because tomorrow is the 1-year anniversary of the Boston Marathon bombing, I wanted to talk about that. You've run a series over at whowhatwhy.org telling us that everything we've heard is not necessarily true. So I know it's a long, complicated story, but what can you tell us? What are you saying, that the Tsarnaev brothers were not responsible for it?
I am saying that the more we look at this, and let me stress that at Who, What, Why, we are essentially agnostic about almost everything. Other than basic shared human values, we don't come in with a preference for outcomes. And that, we believe, is what great journalism is all about. So when we look at anything, we don't assume that anybody is or is not telling the truth, but when we notice things that don't stack up right, we look into them. The Boston bombing, from the first week, we were the only news organization that I know of in the world that began asking questions. The first thing that struck us, Nicole, was this tremendous rush to judgment. Now, as you know from my book, Family of Secrets, I've done a lot of research on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and the echoes between these two events are rather remarkable. With Lee Harvey Oswald, there was this tremendous rush to pin it on him and to say that they knew with great certainty that he had done it, despite the fact that they really didn't have any evidence. And with the Boston bombing, we saw essentially the same thing. The public was told that they had this evidence, but they did not show it. And in fact, a year later, they have still not shown it. So that's the first thing. And of course, we can talk about that. But there's much more going on here. There were all these other related events. There was the shooting of a police officer, which actually was what precipitated the final, let's say, face-off with these two brothers.
Right, that was the 7-Eleven or whatever convenience store,
that was the MIT police officer.
Right, inside a convenience store, right?
No. See, there you go. See, there's the problem, Nicole.
Okay.
They said it was that he ran into them at a convenience store. That's what most people believe, and that he confronted them and they shot him. Actually, that's what they put out, but that was a false story. It later became, no, they shot him while he was in his squad car on the MIT campus. It later became something different and so on. And I did an article on our site, Who, What, Why. You can go there and you can go to the search box and just type in Boston bombing Officer Collier, and you can read this long report I did about how they kept changing that story. It turns out this police officer was sitting in his car at an improbable spot between two buildings on campus at night for no apparent reason, when someone came up to him and shot him in the head, and then did not take anything, did not even take his gun. Now, we are told that that was the Tsarnaev brothers. Why they would have been on a darkened campus at that point, why they would have shot him at all, why they would have shot him and then not taken his gun when supposedly they needed additional firepower, makes no sense. And you have to remember, when you go back to the Oswald story, the reason they caught Oswald was supposedly shortly after someone unknown shot John F. Kennedy, someone shot a police officer. Now, I don't want to make too much of this, but it is interesting, these kinds of similarities. And again, this rush to judgment where we concluded that these two brothers had definitely done it. Now, what was the evidence that they had done it? What we have been shown, Nicole, is video of these two brothers walking wearing backpacks. That is it. That is it. We have not been shown one iota of evidence that they did it. And so the problem becomes that it seems that they are problematical individuals up to some point. It seems that they may have been involved in something, but what exactly that something is, we don't know. The FBI originally claimed they had no idea who these two men in the photos were, and could anybody come forward and identify them. So who came forward? The Russians. The Russians said, we know who they are because we suspected them of being terrorists, and we warned you 2 years ago about them, and you did nothing. Now, that's very, very interesting when we need the Russians to tell us the truth. And so as you start looking at this, what you find, Nicole, is that the Tsarnaev brothers were well known to the FBI, that the FBI was literally in their house talking with them 2 years before the Boston bombing, and then basically didn't want the public to know that. So you've got to focus on all of that. You've got to focus on the extent to which they were flagged, the extent to which they knew anything about them. Now, one of the possibilities, and this is something you will never hear either in the mainstream media or in the so-called liberal or alternative press, because nobody wants to touch this stuff, is the possibility that at least the elder Tsarnaev had been some sort of FBI informant. The FBI regularly tries and turn foreign nationals living in the United States and get them to cooperate and to infiltrate alleged terror plots. This goes on all the time. This is heavily documented. The FBI would not dispute that this is a standard policy of theirs. The high likelihood is that at some point, if the FBI was interacting with Tamerlan Tsarnaev, and if they even suspected that either he might be involved with some kind of either terrorist groups or just dissident groups, that they might have asked him to inform on them and perhaps to do more. That, I think, is where this story is going. That, I think, is what the authorities are so terrified of, is that something may have gone terribly wrong, and this simply cannot come out.
So, okay, now let me play devil's advocate for a moment. And here's the thing, Russ Baker, I know you, I trust your reporting, and I know you're a responsible journalist. But, you know, in some ways, look, yes, I believe you're the only responsible journalist who's come out actually questioning the official story. But we have, you know, you've got Alex Jones, who immediately was screaming, false flag, false flag. Do you believe this was a false flag operation?
Look, here's the problem. You have to evaluate journalists on their own merits, and I don't think that I need to explain to anybody my track record of 25 years of solid journalism for major mainstream news organizations. So if I was good enough for the mainstream, I'm good enough when I do my own thing with who, what, why. And I can't speak to any people who have radio shows or anything else. I don't have anything to do with them. Frankly, I'm not that interested in what they say because we do our own original research. Okay. But the fact of the matter is this. If you go back to our website, Who, What, Why, we ran an article by Steve Weinberg, a former executive director of the National Group of Investigative Reporters and Editors, and he wrote about how the media has falsified the history of the FBI throughout its history, how the media has willingly worked with J. Edgar Hoover to create a false image of what this agency
right. Well, you know, was. And look, the FBI, I don't trust them, just like I don't trust the NSA or the CIA or any of the, you know, the alphabet agencies, because they make it difficult. It's the old fool me once to you know, misquote George W. Bush. Russ Baker, I want to talk back to you know, go back to some of the reporting you've done, because one of the big stories that we heard that that was reported that the one guy who identified these brothers was the driver of the car that they allegedly carjacked, and he that they confessed to him and everything. And now you've got two articles, it's a two-parter at whowhatwhy.org, saying that whole story, there are a lot of holes there. Tell us what we were told that was wrong.
Right. So I began just looking at this individual who is nicknamed Danny because at the time, shortly after the carjacking, they did not release his name, and in media accounts, they began to use a nickname for him. He appeared on the Today Show, a couple of these national TV things, with his face and his voice disguised, and they referred to him as Danny. He's a Chinese national living in the Boston area. And I became interested in him, A, because they wouldn't say who he was. I've never seen that before in any such thing. Normally, if somebody is carjacked and, as he supposedly did, brilliantly escapes and lives to tell about it, when both of the perpetrators, one is dead and the other is in custody, there would seem to be no reason that he wouldn't show his face and we wouldn't know who he was, and at least sort of, listen to his story, if not honor him for his alleged bravery. And yet they've kept his identity under wraps all of this time. And so I was interested in his story, and as I looked at it, I noticed some things that were very unclear. So I went to the Boston Globe reporter who actually sat down with this fellow and spoke to him about it. And the more I looked into this, the more I saw anomalies. It took me almost a half a year working with my team at Who, What, Why before I could see what it was. And in that two-part series you mentioned, we go through these things. This Danny has actually told conflicting stories, and his story seems to have evolved. The original story suggests that he may not have been carjacked at all, that in fact the two brothers, clearly fleeing for their lives because they were marked men at that point on Thursday of the week of the bombing. They were clearly marked men. They thought that their lives were in danger because there was a police manhunt out for them, and they appeared to be trying to flee the Boston area. And it seems that they took this guy's car. Now, taking the car is a carjacking, but it is not a hostage carjacking. And in one account, Danny appears to say that they took his car and left him by the roadside. In a subsequent interview about a week later, he says that they took him hostage, they drove him around, and then in different accounts, he tells different stories about how he escaped. In one version, they kept him for 30 minutes in the car. In another version, they kept him for 90 minutes in the car. In one version, he says that he was sitting in the car at a gas station, that one of the brothers was inside paying for the gas while the other brother was outside the car pumping, that he simply opened the door and left the car, crossed the street, told a gas station attendant across the street to call the police, and that was that. In the final version, the one that got the most play on all the major media, in that version, he's sitting in the car next to Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older brother. The brother gets distracted for a second, and he makes a dash for it. That's a very, very different story, and there simply is no possibility that he just couldn't remember what happened.
Okay, so now Russ Baker is with us. Russ Baker, the editor-in-chief of whowhatwhy.org, investigative journalist. Again, I trust Russ. I believe, I think your as you said, your credentials stand for themselves. Author of a brilliant book that you must read, Family of Secrets, about the Bush crime family, especially if we may wind up with a third Bush, running for president. Important information to know. So basically, the extensive reporting at whowhatwhy.org is saying that at least you need to question the official story we're being told about what happened in the Boston Marathon bombing. Now, do we know, is there a trial date set for the surviving brother?
Yes, September.
In September. Now, is there any reason? Look, I'm not a crime reporter. I honestly, when a lot of these murder trials are televised and such, I tune out. I don't pay attention, so I don't know a lot of these answers. Could they be holding back information? I mean, you said there's so much that we don't know. Well, is that because they haven't gone to trial yet and they don't want to taint, any more than it's already tainted a potential jury pool, or because there's stuff that they do save for trial?
There are so many inconsistencies. What I have shared with you on this program is about 1% of all the problematical material. There's so much problematical material. It's so overwhelming that, as far as I know, and there are quite a few amateur researchers looking at this stuff, almost everyone who actually looks at this stuff, as opposed to reading conventional media. You see, 90% of us get almost all of our information from establishment media, and I would count in that this sort of so-called kind of liberal things like MSNBC. They basically all report almost exactly the same stuff with a slightly different slant. So almost all of us are in a filter bubble. We have no idea what is really going on in the world, and everything comes to us from a bunch of so-called journalists who are terrified of losing their jobs, not being able to put their kids through Ivy League schools and so forth, and or being held up to ridicule. So we simply don't know what's going on. But those who actually look into these things see tremendous problems with this story. And if you go back historically and you look at the Gulf of Tonkin, or you look at, as we did a story on whowhatwhy.org about the cover-up of Hiroshima, how the U.S. government suppressed documentary films about what really happened at Hiroshima. I mean, cover-ups, and remember the Maine. I mean, going back to the Spanish-American War. This is the nature of large institutions, the nature of government. This kind of thing always goes on. As far as this case goes, I don't know exactly what happened, but I know that we are not being told the truth. I also suspect that the U.S. government will never go to trial with this thing.
Really?
Tamerlan Tsarnaev, by the way, has pled not guilty.
You mean Jahar?
I'm sorry, Jahar, thank you. Jahar Tsarnaev has pled not guilty. That's very significant because they are, he faces a potential death penalty, and usually what you do is you plead to a lesser charge to avoid that, but instead he's taking a risk with the death penalty and saying, I didn't do what you accused me of. That's very, very significant. Now, his lawyers have a difficult game, and if you look at the woman who's in charge of his defense, a federal defender, and interestingly, he should have top flight private counsel of the sort that, say, O.J. Simpson had. That's really what he ought to have. Instead, he's got feds who've been assigned him. That in itself is a bit of a tragedy in terms of getting to the truth. But in any case, the woman who is handling that, her big thing is plea bargains. And so she's not really all about getting to the bottom of things. She certainly doesn't want to risk her career by saying that the emperor has no clothes. So she's looking to get out of this thing and get this guy with a lesser sentence. Now, I think what's going to happen here is she's going to push him to change his plea to guilty under extenuating circumstances and maybe get like a 20-year sentence. But I'll tell you something else. They are playing a little bit of hardball, and the defense has now alleged that that the FBI did in fact attempt to recruit the older brother, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, as an FBI informant. That is very significant, although they then add this highly improbable clause to say that it was probably their attempt, which they claim to have failed, that caused Tamerlan Tsarnaev to be under pressure to act wacky and to become very, very extreme. So they're trying to do a kind of a limited hangout, sort of blame it on the older brother who went nuts, and then the younger brother either didn't do anything or played a minor role. I don't think that's the truth either.
Right. So, so Russ Baker, with all the work you've done, and you've spent the better part of the last year looking into this story, do you believe that the Tsarnaev brothers are innocent?
I'm hesitant to conclude anything. We're going to be doing a lot more research on this. We're ramping up our research team as we speak. As you know, we're a non-profit, and we don't take any ads, so our ability to do this stuff is entirely dependent on the public getting behind us and supporting these efforts with contributions. But having said that, we intend to stay on this story and dig further. I will tell you this. I don't know whether the one or the other brother is innocent. I don't know that you can say that that one brother necessarily is the same as the other brother. I would like to see the purported video of them planting the bombs. I noticed that they described the bombs as being the backpacks being a particular color, and I noticed that the color of the backpacks that the brothers were wearing is different than the color of the backpack that you see blown apart.
Right.
All of those things trouble me. I don't know if I would say they were innocent. My guess is that as in most of these situations, it's a much more complex and nuanced formula, such as the older brother may have been recruited very covertly, of course, into something. He may have been asked to pretend that he was an Islamic radical. It's important to note that his uncle was married to the daughter of a high-ranking CIA officer. We'll be having more to say about that in upcoming articles. It's important to note that the family was actually deeply nested in a kind of a network of intelligence people long before any of this. And so I think it's entirely possible that this guy, just like Lee Harvey Oswald, was essentially a patsy, that he was brought in to some kinds of intelligence operation, probably actually thought that he was serving the United States, most likely went to Russia to infiltrate terrorist cells, and then somehow the whole thing was turned. Now, who turned him? I don't know. I'm not saying that was the FBI. It could have been some other service. It could have been a cell within some kind of service. Something could have been intended. Maybe he thought he was part of a drill. We know there was a drill with backpack bombs that was supposed to happen in Boston around this time.
Really?
That's very important. It hasn't gotten enough attention. Did he think he was part of a drill? And did somebody set him up and then put a real bomb out there? We don't know. But here's the takeaway from this whole thing, Nicole. There have been no terrorist attacks in the United States since 9/11. The whole 9/11 story itself, as we know, and Who, What, Why has done stories about documenting new and significant ties between the Saudi royal family and a family in Florida. You know, we've talked about that. Since that whole 9/11 story needs to be looked at further, but since 9/11, there have been no terrorist attacks of any note, really, or even attempted in the United States until the Boston bombing. Because the Boston bombing itself is also highly suspect, and because they use these things, when I say they, I'm talking about the military-industrial complex, aka the CIA and the arms manufacturers that General Dwight Eisenhower warned us about, because they use these things to convince us that we need to give our tax dollars to vast and completely unaccountable, massive spending that all ends up in the pockets of a handful of rich people to supposedly protect ourselves. That's the real story we need to be looking at here.
But there's so much. And look, I've no doubt that the media is you know, it is totally corrupt, not in the sense of, you know, taking payoffs to report something, but they, you know, they do their master's bidding. Whatever the corporate masters want is what we get. I have no illusions that we get the truth from the corporate mainstream media. I'm just trying to figure out, I mean, what would the motivation, what would the motive be for? So
in 1992, as the Soviet Union was falling apart, Paul Wolfowitz, Dick Cheney, and a bunch of other people working for George H.W. Bush, who's a major figure in my book, Family of Secrets, which I urge everybody to read because it contextualizes current events. It explains what really goes on in this country and how we got where we are and what's happening right now. Anyway, back in 1992, these guys got together and they literally produced a memo that said, now that the Soviet Union is over, we run the world. It's in this memo, it said the United States is the sole and undisputed superpower, and we have an opportunity to basically project our power anywhere in the world where we feel we need to go in. Now, that was their position. George H.W. Bush signed off on this. This thing was leaked. He panicked. He backpedaled a little bit, but this thing was never rescinded. Okay, that explains why General Wesley Clark, and if you go to our website, whowhatwhy.org, type in Wesley Clark in the search engine, Wesley Clark has warned that he saw a memo right after 9/11 listing 7 countries countries that the United States intended to invade on the excuse of 9/11. Now, if you go back to the late 90s, the Project for a New American Century, a neocon group, which you've talked about in your show many times, Nicole. The Project for New American Century, the same group of people said that the problem they were having was that in order for the United States to so-called project its strength and be able to invade anywhere that U.S. interests were at stake, and the U.S. interests, by the way, often means nothing more than mines, oil fields, and other stakes of large corporations, they said in order to convince the American public that we need to go in there, nothing short of, quote, another Pearl Harbor would suffice. That was several years before 9/11. What we are seeing in all these things, and the Boston Marathon bombing is the same kind of thing. It's a traumatic event that is not just a traumatic event. It happened at an iconic moment, just like 9/11 happened with iconic buildings. The Boston Marathon bombing, the Boston Marathon is a great icon. Boston is a great icon in the American pantheon of the American Revolution and so forth. April 15 was a double whammy. It was tax day with people very stressed out. All of these kinds of things come together. Then they put out this stuff, Boston Strong, and on and on and on, with huge amounts of flag waving and so forth. I mean, we've seen this before. The Reichstag fire in Germany, certainly the Soviets did this kind of thing. This kind of use of fear and of myth making and of propaganda is not exclusive to any society. Unfortunately, our country, with all of its good qualities, is often run by people who see no reason not to take advantage of these kinds of things for what they perceive to be the right course of action.
All right, but yeah, if you look at that, I know, at Who What Why, yes, you do question the official story about 9/11. So let me ask you this. Based on all the work you've done, and we've only got like 2 minutes left, so it's going to have to be quick, but based on all of the investigations you've done, do you think we've been told anything near the truth, close to the truth about what happened on 9/11?
I absolutely don't. I mean, I could just tell you I was down in Sarasota, Florida recently. I've got articles to come on that. But, I mean, among other things, I mean, who Mohammed Atta was, never reported. Who he really was, I mean, this guy so clearly was some kind of an intelligence officer, and I do not mean terrorist. And according to, this guy had a girlfriend down there for a couple of months. The girlfriend, who there's no reason to believe that she wasn't telling the truth, said that he had 6 pilot's licenses prior to ever coming to the United States to supposedly learn how to fly a Cessna. I mean, from A to Z, the U.S. government has never made a serious attempt to investigate this thing. I'm not suggesting where this goes, who was behind it. Most of these things turn out to be enormously complex, with lots of different dirty elements within and without government doing their own thing. There look to be elements of huge drug operations connecting to this, the nexus with all kinds of different alphabet soup of intelligence agencies, like a bunch of Keystone cops watching each other, infiltrating each other. I mean, the world is an infinitely complex place, Nicole, and as we're running out of time, I'd just like to say that is why I founded whowhatwhy.org. That is why we do what we do, because in all the years I was in the mainstream media and I wrote for all those wonderful alternative, so-called liberal sites and publications, none of them were ever willing to touch any of this stuff. Simply put, they're scared of it. And that, I'm afraid, means that they ought not to be in journalism.
Right. And so the future, really, if you want to get news that's sort of unencumbered by corporate, overlords, you need to go to whowhatwhy.org. And very quickly, because we've got Victoria Jones standing by at the Talk Radio News Service, the future of, The Intercept, do you see that as that's a new Glenn Greenwald news site with, do you see, people, I'm always encouraging people to come and find independent sources of information, because I think that's where you're going to get the most uncorruptible reporting.
Absolutely. There are lots of new outfits starting up. I say the more the merrier. The
Mm-hmm.
more of them that there are, the more people will understand there is another explanation. I like to think that at Who, What, Why, what we are doing is going to be a little bit bolder than most of these new startups, because we've already dealt with the trauma of kind of crossing over a little bit, being a little bit more open to larger possibilities.
Gotcha. Russ Baker, thanks for jumping on in spite of the allergy suffering. I really appreciate it, and keep up the good work. Find Russ at whowhatwhy.org. Russ Baker, thank you so much.